Hi everybody. In the previous video, we learned about Django admin and created a super user. In today's video, we are going to create our signup, sign-in, sign-out functionality. First, we will add the forms in our sign-in page. Then we will add the URLs. And then we will create our tasks in the views file. Lastly, we will add some JavaScript and JSON to give the user a better experience during the process. In each step, we will test our code and see the results in the browser. Let's check our editor before we start the development server, as we changed some structure by adding folders and files. First, we added 2 folders in our templates. We put our homepage in the blog folder and our about page in the sign folder. And we added a sign.html file which will contain both our signup and sign-in form. We also added a base file for our sign page as we want another footer. Creating different base files is very useful for that. We have also made more separations of our CSS code. Eventually, we will make a separate CSS file for most of our pages. Quick look to how we link them. On the base home file, we linked our base and blog CSS. And on the base sign file, we linked our base and sign CSS. Now onto our views file to see what was added. Because our homepage.html file is now located in the blog folder, we need to add it to our return link. Same for our about page, it's now located in the sign folder, so we have to add that to the return. We added 2 tasks. One for the sign up page and one for the sign in page. For now we just return the sign page. Both tasks returning the same HTML page means we will put both the sign-in and sign-up form on the same page. Feel free to create a separate HTML file for both. Let's check our URLs file. A URL was created for each task, one for the sign-in and one for the sign-up. And depending on which form is submitted, recognized by the URL name in the form's action tag. Sign-in page or sign-up page. The corresponding task in the views page will be executed. Remember, both our tasks return the same HTML file. So for the user, it does not matter on which URL they are, they will always see the same page with the 2 forms. But again, feel free to create a separate HTML file for sign-up and sign-in with each their form. We'll now add the sign-up task, start our development server, and go to the home page. Hold on. In our base home file, we added the sign-in URL to our link. Let's click the link. It brings us to the sign HTML page. Let's see what we have done there. First, our usual Django tags, making this page an extension of the base sign file, allowing a different footer, and our open block content tag. All our CSS is separated, but we gave one element design here with the style tags. We'll move it later to our CSS file. Wrapping everything in a div. First block is for our sign-in form, but it's not added yet as we will first do the sign-up functionality. We just added a div with some styling and a message and a button without any form to submit. Next comes our block that will display our messages about username or password mistakes. Or if successfully registered, a welcome message. We gave the block a fixed height so the messages will always displayed nicely in this area without moving other elements. As we saw in a previous video, this is an iteration over a list of messages that we populate in our tasks. When a message is found, it is displayed in the Django double accolades output tag. Closing our tags, and now on to the sign-up form. It's a big block of code, but only a few lines are essential, all the rest is layout and design. The form can be seen as this area on the sign page. Opening the form HTML tag and giving it a post method. The action is linked to the signup URL name, making sure the correct task will be executed. The CSRF token. Here the elements needed to display the user icon correctly. The first input field for the username. Text format. We gave it a name which we will use in our task to capture the input. We gave it a maximum length of 15, which we will also verify in our task in case somebody is able to cheat the field. And made it required. The ID field will be used for our JavaScript later. First we need to make it work on Django and Python code only, to avoid security gaps. In the meantime we arrived to our password input field. We gave it a type password. And a name to use in our task to capture the input. We also made it a required field to fill. We also will add some JavaScript to it later, so already adding its ID. And here the block to confirm the password. Same elements to display the icon. Onto the confirm password input field. Again, we gave it the type password which makes the input hidden in the browser. And a name to capture the input in the task. We made it required. And already added the JavaScript ID for later. Lastly, our submit button, type submit. Closing our form. And on the bottom of the page, a separate container with some informational text for the user. And the last tag is to close our content block. Done. As you saw, only a few lines of code on this page are essential. All the rest is structure and design, for which plenty of free snippets exist online. Let's go to our signup task. And make the editor bigger so we can have a better view. On the top, we have imported some tools for our task. The redirect. An authentication tool. Our user model. The Django messages context box. And a markup tool. Onto our signup task, which will be executed top-down. So the first statement that will be checked is one to see if the user is signed in. We don't want signed-in users to be able to visit the signup page. This statement is the reason why we imported the auth tool. Instead of a return with a render, we will now return a redirect to the home page. Check how this works. The home page is actually the URL name of the homepage task. If the statement is true and a signed-in user tries to visit the signup page, it will execute the homepage task. Note: we don't need to use a redirect. We could copy the homepage task and put it in our authentication statement. Give it a correct indentation. And it would have the same result as our redirect. But needless to say that redirects help us in a big way to avoid duplicate code. If the statement is not true and the user is not signed in, the task will execute the else statement. Within the else, we again have an if-else statement. We already know it, checking if there was a post method submit. If there was not, the else statement will be executed on the same indentation. Which takes us to our original root task, to return a render of the sign HTML page. If the statement is true and there was a post method submit, we will capture the user's input by using the input field names of the form and store them in variables. First, the username, which we force into lowercase characters to avoid duplicate usernames in our database. Next, our first password, storing it in a variable. And our confirmation password, also storing it in a variable. Now we can perform checks on the variables. A first if-else statement to check if the passwords submitted are the same. Note we are checking the last requirement of the form first. If the statement is not true and the passwords are not equal, we will execute the else statement. Here we will be using the Django message tool to store a message of choice. It acts like the context box, but can be passed around more easily. So in case the passwords don't match, we will redirect to our own signup task. As explained, the redirect is linked to the URL name, which will execute its task. As we redirected to our signup task, it goes through the same logic. The user is still not signed in and no post method submit was detected, as it was only a redirect. So the else statement is executed, bringing us back to our root task to render the sign page, but with the message box included. That's what's making Django messages so convenient. Let's test this passwords not equal task. We given a username and password that meet the criteria, but confirm the password with a different one and hit submit. It works, we got our message. And no user is created or will ever be created if the passwords don't match. We will later implement some JavaScript to let the message disappear, but for now, we just refresh the page to clear the message box. If the passwords do match, we can continue with our next nested if-else statement. This is a very long statement with many checks. Normally a statement has to be on the same line, but by using brackets, we are allowed to put the checks on separate lines, which helps visibility. Opening and closing brackets. And the colon to end the statement. So what are we doing here? Checking if the length of the password is greater or equal than 8. The minimum length requirement which we set. And, with stressing the tag, and. Checking if there is at least one digit in the password by using the isDigit Python function and an iteration over the password characters. Doing the same for a lowercase character with the isLower Python function and an iteration over the password's characters. And checking if there is at least one uppercase character by using the isUpper Python function and an iteration over the password characters. As always, we will first see what happens if the password does not meet all the requirements and the statement is therefore not true. Then the task of the else statement will be executed. The task is similar as in our previous else statement. We put a message in the Django message box and return a redirect to the name of the signup URL. Which brings us back to the same task and same checks. The user is still not signed in. And as we're coming from a redirect, no post method submit was detected. So the else statement will be executed, which is the root task of returning a render of the sign page, but with our message included. Reminder: you don't have to use redirect, but you would have to include the whole signup task in this else statement instead. Let's test our code. Entering a username that meets the requirements. And a password with the minimum length but without digits. This works, we see our message. Again the same username and a password with the minimum length but with only digits and no lowercase character. Also works. We get our message. Again entering a username that meets the requirements and a password with the minimum length, a digit and lowercase characters but without an uppercase. It works. We get our message. And no user is created or will ever be created if the password does not meet all the requirements. Take some time to make sense of what we did so far. Our task checked if the user is signed in. If not true, it checked if a post method was submitted. If true, it checked if the passwords match. If true, it checked if the password meets all our criteria, which we accomplish with the and tag between the checks. In case the statements were not true, we redirected the task to itself, which eventually brings us back to showing the sign page, but with a message included. Mind all the indentations and structures used. We checked our form starting from the bottom field and nested our way up. But the order can be chosen freely. Note that you can precise the messages the users see by separation and nesting with more if-else statements. But our task is solid and already gives the user a good idea of what went wrong. We will further detail the messages with JavaScript in the front end. Finally, when the user is not signed in, and a post method submit was detected and the passwords match and meet all requirements, we can perform our final checks, which are on the username. Here the if-else statement is a little bit different, as we have added an extra if statement. By putting the if statement in between, it will be executed after the if statement but still before the final else statement. You can put several if statements under each other before putting the final else. In contrast to our previous statements, we will not check the else statement first, as that is our final statement where we create the user. So we first do our if statement. Here we check if a username already exists in our database. We call our user model and put a filter on it to check if there is a username that matches the user input. If the statement is true and the username already exists, we will put a message in the Django message box and return a redirect to the task itself. That brings us back to the start logic of the task. The user is still not signed in and no post method submit was triggered as we are redirecting. So the else statement will be executed, same indentation. Which brings us back to the root task, showing our sign page, but with our message included. Let's test this code. We enter the super username as we know it already exists, and a password that meets all requirements. Hitting submit. And it works. We get our message, and no user was created or will ever be created if the username, which we forced to lowercase characters, already exists. If the name does not exist, before executing the else statement, we want to do some more checks, so we add the if statement for that. Although the statement is also a long one, we didn't wrap it in brackets, so it has to be written on the same line. First, we check if the username is less than 2 characters. Here we use the or tag, in contrast of the and tag, where all checks have to be true to make the whole statement true. With the or tag, only one check has to be true for the whole statement to be true. So if the length of the username is less than 2 characters, the statement will already return a redirect with a message. But we will add more checks first. Checking if the length of the username is greater than 15 characters. Checking if there is a non-alphanumeric character in the username, as we don't want that. We do this by using the allNumber Python function. This time on the full username string, instead of an iteration over the characters. Lastly, we check if the username is missing a lowercase character, as we don't want that. In case any of the checks is true, the whole statement will be true and add a message to the message box and return a redirect to the task itself. Performing again the logic. The user is still not signed in. A post method submit was not triggered as we are redirecting. So the else statement will be executed, which is to show the sign page with our message. Let's test our code. Entering a username with only 1 character and a valid password. It works, we get our message. Now we will try a username with only special characters. Entering a valid password. It works, we get our message. And now a username with numbers only. Entering a valid password. And it also works, we get our message. No user is created or will ever be created if any of the checks are true. Note that we did not test the maximum length of the username as we specified the maximum length in the form field. But in case the field fails, our check works, we have tested it. Now we come to the core of our task. If the user is not signed in, and a post method submit is triggered, and the passwords match and meet requirements, and the username did not fail the checks, we can now execute the else statement and create the user in our database. As we cannot do a standalone creation, we have to define a variable, which we call object. We will not do anything with the variable, it just had to be added to be able to execute the creation. It's a little bit strange, but this is how it has to be done. For the creation, we first call the user model. And like we did with filter, we add the createUser Django function. And simply store the username and password in the model's corresponding fields. When the user is created, we will add a welcome message to the return. But as we want to include the username, we needed to import the mark save tool. And we again return a redirect to the task itself. Which brings us back to the beginning of the task via the URL name. The user is still not signed in, no post method submit was triggered, so the else statement is executed, which is showing the sign page, with our welcome message included. Let's test our code. First, a username that meets the criteria. And a valid password. Hitting submit. And it works, we have created our first user, T1, and get our welcome message. We will quickly verify in the admin console if the user was really created. Enter your admin URL. Sign in with your super user credentials. Entering our user model. And our T1 user is indeed successfully created. There's not much to see inside the profile, only the name and password, which is encrypted. Our important sign-up task is ready. Please take the time to make sense of it. Pay attention to all indentations, statements, and nesting used. As a reminder, you could start with the username check first and work your way down on the form. It should still work the same, give it a try. At the end of the video we'll also add some JSON to see if the username exists, but without a page refresh. We will now add our sign-in form and task. And a sign-out button and task which will be visible on the homepage, to signed-in users only. Hold on. This is the change on our sign page. We have added the sign-in post form. And linked it to the URL name of the sign-in task. The Django CSRF token to protect the data. The username's input field, which we gave a name. And the password's input field, which we also gave a name. And our submit button. And all the rest is the same structure and design of the sign-up form. Let's see what we did on the homepage to show a sign-out button to users that are signed in. We added this block of code. It's a Django function. Making something very complex very easy. It checks if the visitor is a signed-in user. A very powerful yet simple statement to hide whole parts of your website from non-signed-in users. Mind the signs. If signed in, a message will be visible. And a link in the form of an icon. Link to the sign-out URL. Let's check the URL. Same familiar structure. We have the URL location. For HTML links. And the URL name for forms and redirects. Whenever the URL is requested, the sign-out task will be executed. Let's go to the views and check our sign-in task. Same familiar structure. First statement we already know. It checks if the user is signed in. If so, the user will be redirected to the home page. If not signed in, the else statement will be executed. We check if a post method submit was triggered. If not, the else statement will be executed, which is showing our sign page. In case the statement is true and a post method submit was triggered, we capture the user's input by using the form field's name and store it in variables. Forcing username to lowercase. Now we will use the Django authentication tool to sign in with the user's input and store the result in a variable. If the result, stored in the variable user, is not none. Or in other words, there exists indeed a user with the credentials provided in the form. Then we will sign in the user by using the login function of the Django authentication tool. And we will redirect the user to the home page where a message and sign out button will be visible. In case the result of our authentication attempt returns none, and no such user exists, we will add a message to the Django message box and return a redirect to the task itself. which brings us back to the top. The user is still not signed in. No post submit was triggered, as we are redirecting, so the else statement is executed, which is showing the sign page with our message included. Let's test our code. First, entering a non-existing username and an existing password. It works, we get our message. Now an existing username, but with the wrong password. Also works. We get our message. Now we sign in with all the correct credentials. And we have been redirected to the home page where we now see a message and sign out button. We are signed in. Before we check the sign out task, let's check if the redirect for signed in users works. It works. When we try to go to the sign up or sign in URL, we are redirected to the home page. For the sign out task, we first need to import a tool, login required. A very handy tool that we can wrap around our task. It makes sure that the sign out URL and task can only be executed by users that are signed in. If not signed in, we can enter a URL name to redirect the user. It's a very simple task coding-wise. Whenever a signed-in user requests a sign out, the logout function of the authentication toolbox will log out the user and redirect to the home page. Let's give it a try. It works. We are signed out, redirected to the home page, where the message and button is no longer visible. And the sign page is again available. Testing the sign out URL redirect for non-signed-in users. Also works. Let's log in one more time. Entering our credentials and hit submit. Works perfectly, we are signed in and seeing the sign out button again. Redirect working. Sign out working. And the sign in page is again available. We have now created a fully working sign up, sign in, and sign out functionality. We will now add some JavaScript to display messages while the user is writing, so without submit and page refresh. But remember, it's key to have your application fully working with Django first. Also, as the tutorial is about web development with Django, we will not go into so much detail. We do want to give you an idea of what we did, so we'll go over it. For those that could use it, just copy the code, it should work. Hold on. Before we go over the code, let's check the results first. If we try the username with digits only, we get a message. And the same if we enter special signs only. If we choose a username that is already taken, we get a message. And if we choose an available and valid name, we get a green check at the end of the input field. When we enter a password, all requirements are shown, and whenever one is met, its color changes. When all are met, we get a green check at the end of the input field. Same for the confirm password. All works as it should. Now, let's check how we did it. We have added some elements to our message diff. The first is feedback about the username. The second is the feedback for the first password. And the last is the feedback for matching passwords. As we need to call all these elements into the JavaScript, we gave them an ID. And to give the output some design and coloring, we added classes. Here is the output for the password requirements, which will be standard hidden until triggered. And for the confirm password. Checking the requirements of the password and the confirm password is something we can do without going to our backend task or database. The script to do this is fully written on this page at the bottom, which we will see in a moment. Although checking the digits and special characters in the username can also be done in the front end, we will do all username checks in the back end, as we need to visit our database anyway to see if a username is already taken. This is happening without a page refresh, so it's not that simple as the password requirements checks. Checking our CSS. Our output fields, called with #ID name, are set to be standard hidden. And we have a valid and invalid class. Scrolling down to the bottom of the page, to our JavaScript, which we will put in a separate JS file in our static folder later. Script opening tag. With this first block, we call all the needed elements into the script using their IDs, including the input fields of the signup form. When clicking outside the elements, blur will hide the output. First, the function for our password requirements, using an event listener to detect if there is a keystroke. If there is, our output field will be displayed showing all requirements. And then we begin our checks. See if there is a number. If so, show the valid class. If not, show the invalid class. Doing the same for a lowercase character. And for an uppercase character. And for the length. And lastly, when they all match, we will add a bootstrap class to the input fields so that a green check mark appears. On to our password confirmation function. To compare our input fields, we had to use some jQuery, recognized by the $signs, and which can be seen as a functionality within JavaScript. Classes are added and removed based on the results, just like in the password requirements function. To use jQuery, we will have to add one line to our base file, which we will do in a moment. On to our username checks. To check if a username is available, we need access to our backend and database. And to do it without the user having to submit the form, we will use JavaScript to push it to our backend, with a post method through a URL. But as JavaScript and Python are two different languages, we use JSON to convert the form in a format that both languages understand. Then the script will probe the URL to see if a response was sent back by JSON. Depending on the response, it will add or remove classes or messages sent by our task. Before we go to our URL and task, we will add the jQuery link to our base file. It's a link to a script and gives access to jQuery, using Google for this, thank you. Now, let's see what we did in our URL file. Although we already imported our views, we need to separately import our validation task for this functionality to work. And we need to have an exempt for the CSRF token for this data push, which is okay as we are not submitting a password. Here the URL. See the difference with the others? This time adding our task as view, wrapped in the CSRF exempt. The rest is familiar. And last, our view file to check our task. First importing some tools. Views. JSON. JSON response. Scrolling down to our task, which we named username validation view. The task isn't a normal one. As it needs to be able to handle JSON responses, we exceptionally need a Django class-based view for the job. This view is suited for a wide range of applications, including working with JSON. As the JavaScript username check is not essential, we will not go into further detail of the view. We first catch the form, send in JSON format. Filter out the username. Force into lower characters. Then we can do some checks on it using the if, else statement. If the length of the username does not meet requirements, we return a JSON response, consisting out of a message and an error code. Our script will then probe the URL for the response and error code and will then show the corresponding message. We do the same for special characters. And for a lowercase character. And here we go to our database by calling the user model and putting a filter on it to check if the username already exists. Which is eventually the reason why we created this task. And when the username meets all requirements, we return a success. Note that our script isn't probing for a success return. We instructed it to know it's a success when there is no error returned. If an error message is sent, it will put it in the HTML tag assigned. Now we need to do one last thing. As the Django messages from our sign-in and sign-up task do not disappear without a page refresh, the JavaScript messages will push them down when they appear, and that looks bad visually. We can make them disappear with a small script, which we will add now. We gave our Django messages div an ID and set an opacity transition on it in the CSS. Let's scroll to the bottom of the page to see the JavaScript. We create a function to fade the text, call in the div and set opacity to 0. And execute the function after the specified time. And another function to hide the div. We call in the element, set the display at none. And execute the function after the specified time. Let's try the code. First, an invalid sign-in. Cool, our message fades out. Trying an invalid sign-up. And hit submit. Also works. The script gives enough time for the user to process the message that fades out while not really enough to start new input, unless you are very fast. All is done. Our sign-up and sign-in functionality is exactly how we want it. For those that want users to provide an email during sign-up, add an input field, type email, to the form and give it a name. Capture the input in the task, and perform checks on it with an if-else statement, which you could nest in between the passwords and username checks. We will give the user the choice to update their email in their profile page. Later, when we connect our domain name, we will include a forgot password function on the sign page. This was it for now. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you in the next video.